welcome. Thank you for joining us. The loss of Corregidor and the Philippines in 1942 was a devastating blow to the United States and to General Douglas MacArthur. By 1945, in the minds of many Americans and Filipinos, Corregidor, the rock, was not just a military target. It was the site of a military defeat that had to be redeemed. In February 1945, a daring mission was launched to recapture this island. Author Kevin Maurer joins us tonight to discuss this mission. He is the author of several books, including No Easy Day, the first-hand account of the mission that killed Osama bin Laden, and he's covered the military for more than 10 years, traveling to Iraq, Afghanistan, East Africa, and Haiti to tell the stories of American soldiers. His latest work, Rock Force, tells the story of the 1945 retaking of Corregidor. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Maurer.
Hello, welcome. Thank you very much to the MacArthur Center for having me to talk about Rock Force. It's sort of a virtual homecoming for me, as I went to high school in Virginia Beach, and my family still lives there. I mean, my brother lives in Norfolk, so I'm pretty familiar with what you guys do over there, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk to me. So the Rock Force is an interesting book, only in that I really had no idea of anything about Corregidor, anything about the 503rd, and I was in my editor's office in New York, Brent Howard, and his grandfather jumped on Corregidor, and he and I were talking about doing a book together and trying to find a topic, and he's the one that mentioned Corregidor and the 503rd and thought it would make for a great book. But at that point, I really had no idea. The only really familiarity I had with Rock Force was that I saw they've got a mannequin in the Special Operations Museum in Fayetteville, North Carolina, of one of the paratroopers, and I just knew that they had jumped in the Pacific. So for me, this book was as much of a journey of discovery as anything. And what I found, I think, is really an overlooked operation in the Pacific that doesn't get the same sort of fanfare that the operations do, particularly the airborne operations do in Europe. But at the end of the day, I think this is an amazing story, and I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of what I found and some of the characters and folks that you'll meet as you read Rock Force, so that when you do read it, you're actually better and more well-versed in the battle than I was when I first started. So first off, let's talk about Corregidor, the island. It's a little more than 4 miles in length. It's shaped like a rocky tadpole, and it sits in the mouth of the Manila Bay. The island's name comes from the Spanish word for magistrate or corrector. And that's because when the Spanish took over the Philippines, the island was converted into sort of the first stop for ships entering Manila Bay. And that's where you would go and get your manifest checked and everything, and the name stuck. Once a volcano, the island slowly became a fortress. First, when the Spanish were there, obviously, as they put cannons on it to defend the mouth of the bay. And then after the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Americans turned it into the Gibraltar of the Pacific. And that's where it really became a fortress. They dug in these massive tunnels. They built massive bunkers for these giant coastal guns that were built to protect the bay. The head of the tadpole, as you can see in the left side of the map, is called topside. And this is really a built-up mountain. It really looks like a head. It looks like it's sticking its head, like a tadpole sticking its head out of the water. And that's where the parachute drops were made. And near the base of the hotel, sort of where the tail is, around the middle of that, there's a place called Malinta Hill. And that's like a little hump. And that's actually the main tunnel was built there as a storage tunnel. But later, as you'll find, as the Japanese lay siege to the island, that becomes a headquarters for General MacArthur. And then later, it becomes a refuge for the last American survivors. And then 3 years later, it becomes the last refuge for the Japanese defenders. So why is Corregidor important? Why does it hold this mythology, I think, in American military history? Well, in late 1941, General MacArthur was kind of caught off guard by the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, and he was forced to retreat to Corregidor. Months later, under orders from President Roosevelt, the general was whisked away from Corregidor by PT boats in the dark of the night, leaving the defenders there. It was a bitter pill for him. It was a huge humiliation for the American military. And it sort of haunted American forces until the winter of 1945. You know, it's funny, as you read the book, you'll see the paratroopers knew what happened at Corregidor. They knew what happened at Bataan, and they understood this mission to be somewhat of a bit of revenge, somewhat of getting back at the Japanese, because when the Japanese took Corregidor, it was a tremendous blow. General MacArthur was convinced and was ready to surrender with his forces there, but he was only taken out of there under order from President Roosevelt, for the express reason that he was viewed as the general to lead American and Allied forces against the Japanese. So to take back the island, MacArthur calls on the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment. And at that time, it was commanded by a highly trained veteran airborne commander by the name of Colonel George Jones. Now, the mission is to jump onto the island, which is, you know, hemmed in by sheer cliffs, and it's pockmarked by bomb craters, bristling with deadly, spiky, broken tree trunks, and wrest it from the Japanese defenders who await, fully armed and ready to fight to the death. Jones was a West Pointer and an early graduate of the parachute school at Fort Benning. He was stationed in the Panama Canal Zone, first as a company commander, before taking full command of the 501st Parachute Battalion, one of the Army's first airborne units. That assignment earned him the nickname Panama Jones, which sort of sticks with him for the rest of his career. You know, while the 82nd Airborne Division and later the 101st Airborne Division stood out in their fight in Europe, it was the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment that was sent to Australia in 1942, and it was General MacArthur's strategic reserve. It was the only independent airborne regiment in the Pacific Theater. So as you go through the book, one of the first guys you'll meet is a guy named Bill Calhoun. And at the age of only 22, First Lieutenant Bill Calhoun was already a veteran paratrooper. He'd earned a Purple Heart by the time he gets ordered to take Corregidor, and he was the leader of the first platoon for F Company. And in this picture here, he's holding a Thompson submachine gun. Honestly, Calhoun is my Dick Winters. If anyone who's read Band of Brothers, you know, Calhoun really represents the character. The book's narrative is really built on his unpublished memoir. You know, I got 2 copies of this memoir, one from a historian named Paul Whitman, who had edited it and added some context to it. The second copy I got was printed on dot matrix paper with his handwritten notes on it, and that came from his family. And his memoir really is the backbone of the narrative of Rock Force. It gives you the character to follow, as well as it gives him his inner monologue. And I think what stood out to me when I read his memoir was how much of a toll being a combat commander took upon him, how much he loved his men, but also how much he struggled with the mission, struggled with its importance. And I thought it was really telling, because a lot of times, you know, World War II books in particular are written with such a stark right and wrong, good versus evil. And I like the idea of following Calhoun through this battle and really seeing how he deals with combat and deals with being a combat leader. The second important character you're going to meet is a guy named Charlie Bradford. Doc Bradford is what they called him, because he was the 2nd Battalion surgeon. And in 1926, graduate of Harvard, he was part of a team of Boston area surgeons who traveled with the American Hospital Expedition to London during the Blitz to provide medical care in 1940. And then 2 years later, he joined the Army as a captain. He's an orthopedic surgeon, and he started his career in a hospital in Australia. But what was funny is after several broken bones from the 503rd Parachute Jump came in, he thought it might be useful for the regiment to have an orthopedic surgeon on staff. So he finagled some jump training in Australia, got qualified, and then joined the 503rd. He also wrote a memoir, and this is a memoir that was passed around by other historians quite a bit that were writing about Corregidor, and it's been used before as a real soldier's basis, because a couple of reasons. Bradford writes beautifully. He's got a great insight for story, and because he was the surgeon, there was a lot of guys passing in and out of the aid station, so he picked up a lot of stories as the wounded guys came in, and he's able to paint sort of a broader picture of what happened on Corregidor. And he's such a good writer, and he brings such humanity that you actually you get to understand the war a little bit. And he also brings a great admiration for the men around him. He really is a guy who saw the big picture, saw the valor that he was seeing, and was able to capture it really eloquently on the page. The last kind of point of view character that I really focused on was a guy named Private First Class Anthony Lopez. And Lopez was from Colorado. He's the youngest of five brothers. He'd grown up without a father, but the Army really became his new family once he enlisted in 1943. Lopez is the only man that I interviewed, that I wrote deeply about, that was alive. He's passed away since, but I was able to get one of his final interviews at his home in Colorado. Really interesting guy. Is a good storyteller. He tells a couple great stories in the book. One about how he and some of his friends stole a supply truck and was able to find apples, and they found lard, and they were able to use what they stole to make fresh apple pies around the holidays, which was quite a hit with his unit mates. What's interesting about Tony Lopez is his story is important because there's a part in the book, because of the sheer cliffs around Corregidor, some of the guys missed the drop zone at the top, and they were in these ravines that were which is where the Japanese defenders were. And at one point in the book, Tony goes down into one of those ravines to save a wounded paratrooper. And it's a really moving story. It's a really heroic story. But what stuck with me most from my time spent with Tony Lopez was he didn't really want to talk that much about it. He really wanted to talk about the apple pies and some of the funny pranks that he and his unit mates were doing. So, but he really is at the heart and soul of this book, and it really was a privilege to get a chance to spend some time with him. Lastly, and I think the guy that most people will have some familiarity with is Lloyd McCarter. And what's interesting about Lloyd McCarter is he's a former squad leader, and he was a scout in the 1st Platoon. But he and Calhoun have this great relationship because Calhoun handpicks him to be the platoon scout. And that Calhoun says pretty much blatantly, he's not going into combat without Lloyd McCarter. So before the mission, before they actually get on the planes to jump on a Corregidor, Calhoun goes down to the stockade and gets McCarter out, because McCarter had a habit of leaving the unit when they were in garrison. So when they weren't in combat and they were waiting for their next mission, Lloyd McCarter would disappear. And there was always rumors that, where was he? And the rumor was before Corregidor, he was in New Guinea, fighting alongside some Australian units. He had this fearsome reputation of being this really reckless, and he would brawl anyone who challenged him. But what makes McCarter interesting is he's sort of that classic character you see in fiction that, can't be in peace, that he's always out in combat. He's always has this reckless mentality, but was such an essential part of the unit. He was their eyes and ears. The guys trusted him. And when you read the book, you'll find that, when they needed help the most, at one point in the book, there's a bonsai charge, and McCarter is the one that actually goes down, puts himself in harm's way, and actually blunts this bonsai charge. So McCarter is that really interesting character that's kind of a classic guy. He was a lumberjack in Idaho and Washington before joining the military. I mean, he's got this really colorful past. And yet if I invented him and said, I'm writing about this guy, Lloyd McCarter, and he's a former lumberjack for the Congressional Medal of Honor, you'd laugh and say it was going over the top. But it really is why nonfiction is so great. And this guy really existed. The only regret I have really about the parts about Lloyd McCarter is I just never got as much about him as I would have liked. He is such a great and colorful guy and such an interesting part of the story. But I never got to the depth of what I wanted to really flesh him out more than I did. So back to the map now. And as you can see, if you're looking at, this is more the tactical map. This is the plan. So when Jones gets the mission to take Corregidor, he arranges a ride with a bomber crew so that he could do a reconnaissance flight over the island and select landing fields. On one of the passes, he spots 2 clearings on top side, and that top side is the kind of the bulbous head at the front of the island, right? One was an old 9-hole golf course, and the other was the parade field, right? But then on another pass, he sees that there's an airfield on the tail section towards the right of the map on the tail. That's where he decides he's going to jump. He's going to jump on the airfield. It's flat, it's wide, it's easy to jump on. But he's overruled. They order him to land on topside and fight downhill because the Japanese had set up their defenses to repel an amphibious invasion, because that's how the Japanese took the island. The prevailing idea was if you jumping the paratroopers to the top of the island in the middle, they would have the high ground and they would be able to fight down. So they're going to use 2 columns of C-47 cargo planes, and the paratroopers would approach the island from the southwest at about 400 feet. The planes would be over the landing fields for 6 seconds per pass, meaning they'd have to jump in sticks being groups of paratroopers of 6 to 8. And so two aircraft at a time would go over the landing fields. 6 to 8 guys would jump out, and they would make 3 passes. And when they go to jump on the island, the prevailing intelligence tells them that there's about 800 Japanese defenders there. They make a couple recon flights before the actual mission, and what they still think it's only 800 Japanese, but when they get on the ground, they realize it's over 6,000. So you're talking about 3,000 paratroopers jumping into the middle of 6,000 Japanese defenders. So here's the view of Corregidor from topside as you're coming into it during the mission. The white specks you see on the ground there are discarded parachutes, and then the long building you see there is mile-long barracks, which becomes kind of a landmark on topside, but it becomes sort of the center hub where the headquarters is and the aid station is. But the first look you see is this is what it looks like if you're a paratrooper getting ready to jump out of a C-47. You can see the discarded parachutes. You can see sort of the ravines here with the jungle. And what's interesting, there's something special about a paratrooper, right? If you think about it, because you see the trooper there in the picture. He's jumping out with all his gear. He's jumping out with about 2 days worth of food, all the ammunition he's going to need, weapons. And there's sort of something special about paratroopers in that, they have this idea that they can jump out of an airplane into the middle of a combat zone and survive for 2 or 3 days before they need to be resupplied. And that mentality is sort of special and unique. I had the pleasure of going overseas with the 82nd Airborne, modern paratroopers now, and it's the same mentality. It's the same idea. There's a ruggedness to the way paratroopers see the world, the way they fight, and I think it starts with the fact that they're trained and convinced that if you give them 2 days of food and a healthy parachute drop where they're not injured, they're going to be just fine in fighting the enemy. This is how you land. If you guys notice, this is how rugged the material is, or how rugged the ground is. This is a crater here. And this is Chet Nycum. And Chet, I got a great oral history of Chet talking about his time on Corregidor, and he describes his landing pretty vividly. He says, after the jolt of the parachute opening, Nycum looked up into a full canopy. He floated for a few seconds, just enough time to get his bearings. Then the wind pushed him backwards as the ground raced up to meet him. There's no time to adjust. Nycum landed hard on his back in a cloud of dust. And then he was in this crater here. Before he could move, paratroopers from the battalion headquarters jumped next to him and helped him out of his parachute harness. Snatching his Thompson submachine gun from his case, he slid a magazine into the receiver and chambered around. When he got to the lip of the crater, he spotted an American correspondent holding a camera. The man had filmed Nycum's landing, and he'd learned later the footage of him with his World War II leggings made it into the newsreels about the parachute assault on Corregidor, shown in the United States. So it was sort of funny that when I was reading his oral history and I was writing that section of the book, I reached out to Paul Whitman, a historian, and one of the experts on Corregidor, and he had the picture that the correspondent had shot in part of that newsreel of Nycum here landing in the crater, just like he described. Okay, so this is what I mentioned earlier, mile-long barracks. This is mile-long barracks here. It was the world's largest military barracks and had, prior to the war, been used for the billeting of American officers and enlisted personnel assigned to Corregidor. During the American invasion to retake the island, the paratroopers seized the barracks from the Japanese, and then used it as a command post and aid station. Captain Bradford, Doc Bradford, who we talked about earlier, he set up his aid station in Mile-Long Barracks. And if you go to visit Corregidor now, it looks similar to what you see in the picture here. It has got this damaged skeleton look. And when I went to visit, I was there with Paul Whitman, and he started digging in some of the debris in front of Mile-Long Barracks, and he actually pulled out parts of a parachute. So I was able to get parts of a parachute there, right in front of this barracks that's still there today. And if you go and visit, you can still walk around it and walk in it a little bit. So once they get to Corregidor, you can see how rugged the landscape is. Corregidor had been bombed for I think weeks before the paratroopers actually landed. So the ground was chewed up. There were broken trees everywhere. It wasn't like what you expect to see when you think about the war in the Pacific. It wasn't thick jungle. It really was kind of a barren wasteland that was, the trees were all shattered by bombs. There were massive craters, and then there were massive tunnels and caves throughout the island. So the war in the Pacific, was particularly nasty. It was fought in these claustrophobic tunnels and jungles, and often at close quarters. And Corregidor was no different. What was interesting to me a little bit too is as I read about this and having covered both the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was sort of shocking how little quarter was offered by either side. The American soldiers and sailors and Marines, hated the Japanese, and the Japanese hated the Americans, and more so than I think you see over in Europe. Paratroopers, approaching in groups would approach these tunnels and these caves, and they would throw white phosphorus grenades or just shoot flamethrowers into them to get the Japanese out. They weren't going to go in there and dig them out, fight them if they didn't have to. And much of the battle is fought that way in close quarters. Sometimes with trench knives and bayonets, because some of the structures are concrete, so you couldn't shoot in there safely. There's one scene in the book where they go into a machine shop, and the initial fight starts with some of the paratroopers shooting, and the ricochets actually create friendly fire. So they end up having to fight with trench knives and bayonets. So this becomes a very savage fight. And it got so bad that the battalion headquarters at some point sends out a message to all the men and says, look, we need intelligence. So we need to capture some Japanese defenders so we can find out how many are left, where they're hiding, what's going on. And we'll offer a 3-day pass for every prisoner we get. And they still really couldn't get prisoners. So, this battle, the jump is a success, but as they try to break out from the top of topside and start to clear out these ravines, it becomes this daily slog through the ravines, in these tunnels, and often at close quarters. Finally, though, after a couple of weeks, the Americans eventually prevail, and General MacArthur is able to come back to Corregidor. After 3 years after being evacuated, he finally comes back with members of the entourage. And when he stepped off the boat, though, there was still the stench of enemy corpses in the air. The stench was so bad that sailors reported smelling it as they were patrolling the waters around the island. When MacArthur gets to Corregidor, before going up the topside for a ceremony, he sort of drives around the island. He goes to where he used to live, and he goes to Malenta Tunnel, where his headquarters was and where he lived right before he was evacuated with his family. And then he goes up there and looks at some of the batteries that, really were what Corregidor's claim to fame was. And what's interesting is one of the things he says is he's standing in front of Battery Wheeler, which was one of the big, massive coastal guns. And he says, gentlemen, Corregidor is living proof that the day of the fixed fortress is over. And I have that quote in there, and that quote is sort of stuck with me because, I think what he's saying is when the Japanese took Corregidor, they bombed it. They didn't attack it with ships. Corregidor was really built to fight a naval attack and to shoot back at ships. But when bombers get involved, or when you drop paratroopers on top of it, this idea of building a fortress island to protect the mouth of the Manila Bay is far in the past by the time he gets there. And I think the fact that he recognized that, I think, is telling. So when he's done with his tour, he comes up to preside over sort of a final ceremony at the parade ground. And there's paratroopers there. There's infantry from the 34th Infantry Regiment, and they were part of this amphibious part of the assault on Corregidor. And he says, General MacArthur says to Colonel Jones, he says, the capture of Corregidor is one of the most brilliant operations in military history. And then he sees the flagpole and he says, I see the flagpole still stands. Have your troopers hoist the colors to its peak and let no enemy ever haul them down. And so, of course, they hoist the colors again. And what I thought was interesting too is in Bradford's memoir, right? All the officers are standing around Mile High Barracks and they're watching this ceremony and everything. And at the end of it, one of Bradford's friends turns to him and he says, well, that ends the story of Corregidor and the true story. From now on, it's a legend and belongs to the scenario writers. They'll make comic strip heroes out of the real men who fought here. I'm glad we saw our part. They can have theirs. So which I thought was it's interesting that even they were aware that that this battle would probably go down, it would have its own mythology. And I think part of that is baked into the fact that it was such a symbolic, such a bitter loss in 42, and that when they finally get back and take it back to sort of assuage that loss, but also I think the soldiers were aware that it was going to be much bigger and trumped up a little bit, and that the battle that they saw was not going to be the one that was going to be portrayed in history books. And I think at the end of the day, that quote sort of was my North Star as I tried to really dig into giving readers a soda straw view of this fight and really staying as close to the soldier and as close to what they were thinking and less about the big muscle movements of the battle. So that quote, I don't know, it still stuck to that really was the emphasis and what set up the battle. As for the 503rd, Corregidor really becomes one of their defining moments. If you notice here, this is the modern patch for the 503rd now. The unit served in Vietnam, it served in Afghanistan, it served in Iraq. It's part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade based out of Italy. For those of you that have seen Restrepo, the documentary made by Sebastian Junger, those are paratroopers from the 503rd. But the unit is nicknamed the Rock now. And if you notice that the patch, if you look at the patch carefully, you'll see the eagle, but you also see what looks like a tadpole shaped island with the Rock written in it. And this patch right here, the one you see here, was created by the World War II paratroopers that took Corregidor specifically to honor what they did in that mission. And it's still being worn today. Finally, I just want to thank everybody for coming to this. I put this last slide up because I had a chance to go visit Corregidor in 2019. I've mentioned Paul a couple of times in this, and he was really an expert guide, and we walked as many of the locations as I could. If you read the book, you'll notice that some of these locations in the picture are in the book. The one on the left is Wheeler Battery, is where I'm sitting in Wheeler Battery, looking at where Calhoun and his platoon get into a fight on the first day. And then this middle one is where in the Bonsai attack that you'll see in the book, it's where that takes place here. And then Malinta Tunnel, obviously, is that tunnel that we talked about in the middle of the island where MacArthur took refuge. But all these places are still there. It's an amazing battlefield to go and study. The tour is great. But more importantly, I think you get a real sense of just how tough of a fight it was and really what was accomplished by those paratroopers who did jump. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I appreciate the time.
Hey, Kevin.
Jim, how are you, Jim?
Very good. Thanks for the presentation. The book was great. Very glad that you were able to join us tonight. And we do have some questions that are coming in for tonight. The first one is, the assault on Corregidor was made by the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment. I've been told that they used parachutes of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 11th Airborne Division, that several of the parachutes didn't deploy properly, resulting in deaths of the troopers. Is this true? At the time, the 511th was fighting in the Battle of Manila, advancing from the south.
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't think I'm almost positive, I can double check, but I don't think anybody died in the parachute jump. So no, I don't think anybody died there. They did have some injuries. They had far fewer injuries than they anticipated. I think they were counting on 50% injury rate, and they just didn't get it. I'm pretty sure they probably did jump with those parachutes. I'm just guessing though, because they thought they were going to jump into Manila.
Right.
And then they didn't, and they didn't know why they got left off. And then it slowly came out that they were going to Corregidor instead.
Right. Yeah, I had never heard that. I mean, I knew that they were planning on jumping in at Nichols, but it never really came off at that point. When this battle takes place, when is it in relation to the recapture of Manila?
The recapture of Manila is still ongoing during this battle. So it's sort of going in conjunction together.
Kind of right in the middle of it, right in the middle of the battle. Yeah, about February 16th is your drop date. So yeah, exactly.
Right. So it was 10 days on Corregidor. So yeah, about the middle.
Yeah, and I think when MacArthur comes, the Battle of Manila has pretty much ended like that day.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in your book about the 503rd drop in New Guinea at Nadzab?
I make a reference to it. I make a conscious effort really to we try to write this book as close to just Corregidor as I could.
Right.
Honestly, I'm not a historian. I'm a reporter. So I tried to write this as much like a reporter would if I was there and with them versus trying to do like a real history book.
Very good. Very good. Can you tell me who built the Malinta Tunnel?
The Americans built the Malinta Tunnel. They dug it out after they took over Corregidor after the Spanish-American War in 1898.
Now, a Corregidor veteran once took pains to explain to me that the large part of the 503rd were not professional soldiers, but civilians in uniform. How do you compare the World War II men with those you got to know in Iraq and Afghanistan? Have you ever looked into the issue of survivor's guilt?
Okay, couple parts. I see a lot of similarities between the soldiers, particularly paratroopers now and paratroopers then. I think there's a kind of a mentality to a paratrooper, like I mentioned in the speech, when you convince a soldier that you're going to give them everything they need to survive 48 hours on a battlefield and push them out of a plane, that there's a certain mentality to that, and I think that stays regardless to either modern paratrooper or World War II paratrooper. It's an interesting that you bring up that it's a lot of citizen soldiers in the 503rd. Colonel Jones has an issue with that. If as you get through the book, you'll realize that he actually holds back some of the awards from guys, not the real professional soldiers, but from the citizen soldiers, thinking that it wasn't that important to them or they weren't truly soldiers. They were just still citizen soldiers. So
wow,
that divide was there. And then survivor's guilt, I think, is everybody. I think anybody that gets through something like this, I think you have a little of that. I know Tony Lopez, when I spoke to him before he passed away, he had that. He just didn't really want to talk about what he did during the battle. He wanted to talk about things before and after and the funny stories, and he wanted to remember the guys that didn't make it. So I think that's a lasting impact.
Right. Remembering the good things and then the people that are gone. Yeah, I know we see that quite a bit. Can you comment on the condition of the battle site today? Is it readily accessible to tourists?
I can't say more. And Jim, you've been there. I mean, it's an amazing place to go. And I think if you could just spare a day and take the tour, you're not going to be disappointed. But if you can spare a couple of days, what's the great part about that battlefield is that, they'll let you walk around. I climbed all through Wheeler Battery, which is this massive battery where a good chunk of the beginning of the book takes place. I crawled into these ravines. I mean, it's really cool. It's a little more overgrown than when they fought there, obviously, but it's all there. And there's no real, it's not like an American battlefield where they cordon it off and you can't touch anything. And you can really get in as deep as you want to get in. So it's really cool.
Yes, I agree. If I go to the Philippines, that's the only place I really want to stay the whole time I'm there. Favorite place on earth. How hard is it to clean out the Malinta tunnels? With all of the arms in the tunnels, it must have been tough.
That was towards the end of the battle. And I actually, we break the narrative a little bit in the book. And I was able, a good researcher that does a lot with the Imperial Army, he found a first-person account from a Japanese defender. And that's where you really get into that tunnel. And you start to see, it was impossible. They were pouring fuel into the air shafts and they were burning them out. They weren't going in there to clear it. It's impossible to clear it. And if you go on the tour, you get into that tunnel and I wouldn't want to do it. I didn't like being in that tunnel and there was nobody trying to kill me. So
right, exactly. Now, why was an airborne assault preferred rather than an amphibious landing after sustained naval bombardment?
Couple of reasons. One was the Americans had learned a lot from the island hopping, and the Japanese attacked Corregidor on barges, and the Americans were able to hold them off for a while because of it. And the Japanese defense was arrayed to repel an amphibious assault. So it was actually what made Corregidor work and what makes the battle plan work is the fact that they did jump on top and into the middle of their defenses and were able to have the high ground. Because when you see, it really does look like a tadpole that's kind of cresting a little bit with its head. And so those two hills are really difficult to fight over. And so the easiest way to really take Corregidor was to take it from the top, and they had the perfect unit to do it.
Mm. Now, how hard a fight did the Japanese give during the recapture of Corregidor? Did they fight to the death like they did during the Battle of Manila?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Lieutenant Endo, about the middle of the book, Lieutenant Endo organizes most of his defenders into a banzai charge. And it really was the turning point of the battle. It actually forces Colonel Jones at that point to compress his lines because they realized his guys were too spread out. But that battle was hinging a little bit in the beginning, and had that banzai charge worked, it might be a much different book. But yeah, they fought hard. They fought to the end, and it was a nastier fight because of the fact that you had these deep tunnels that some of them were concrete, and a lot of it was flamethrowers and white phosphorus grenades. And there's a couple really kind of nasty battles that teeter right there on the edge. So yeah, they weren't quitting and they fought hard.
Now, your book just came out today, so I think a lot of people are asking questions just because they haven't gotten a chance to see it yet. And this one was the 503rd provided air and naval gunfire support.
Yes, they were, and the battle was so there were so many dead bodies on the island that the naval support, the sailors on the destroyers that were circling around, they could smell the stench from the island. So they had a constant ring around them. They had a constant air attack. And there's a scene in the book where Bradford, the surgeon, is on top of the Mile High Barracks, and he watches these planes attack. He watches the bombardments. And so yeah, it was a constant. They had constant support on that.
And I think you pointed out in your book definitely that the almost 15, 20 days prior to the landing, they're just bombing every square inch of the island as they're getting ready for this.
Yeah, and the troopers would fly over with them, so that these bombing runs would go, and so Colonel Jones went and he scouted the island. They would send other officers to go and scout this island, to the point where they didn't think the Japanese there was only like 800 there, and there ended up being over 6,000. But they believed, because they just didn't see any life on the island, they were bombing it so heavily.
Right. Now, were there any Japanese prisoners of war as a result of the recapture of Corregidor? Just started your book and love it. Well done.
Oh, well, thanks for that. Yeah, there were a few. It got to the point where they had no idea how many defenders were there. And so Colonel Jones sends out an order that says basically he'll give people extra 3 days leave if they can get a prisoner. And even then they just couldn't find them. There's a good scene in the book too, where you'll see where some of Calhoun's men try to go down and get a prisoner, and it almost costs them. So
yeah.
Jim, real quick, that goes back to what we were talking about before, which is that the Japanese were fighting, and they weren't quitting, they weren't surrendering, and I think the fact that they couldn't get a prisoner, you run into that a couple times in the book, speaks to that idea that they were going to fight to the end.
That's the way the whole war was. Really. Do you know the height of the C-47s when the men jumped? I've heard that it was very low. Was that done because they had jumped at a higher altitude? They felt the men would be shot out of the sky by the Japanese?
It was about 300 to 400 feet, and they jumped because of the crosswind. And they had such a small landing zone that they didn't want to miss it. You miss it, you're either going into the water or you're going into some of the ravines. And then they knew at that point the ravines were controlled by the Japanese. And I think it speaks to their training and their discipline to jump with those kind of parachutes that aren't easily, driven and flown, to hit these drop zones, a par 3 golf course and a parade field. And if you go and visit Corregidor, that parade field looks big, but if you got to jump out of a plane and hit it, it's not that big.
And I think you pointed out in your book as well that, like, after the first jump, they saw them kind of moving a little too far, and then they even decreased the height even more. Was that true?
Calhoun makes them go much lower.
Much
he
lower.
gets the choice, though. He talks to the pilot, and his guys jump, I think, at 300 feet.
Wow.
Which I was talking to a buddy of mine who's an Army Ranger, and he just marvels at that. Even with he wouldn't want to do that with his modern parachute, but that's like 1, 2, and then you're down.
Yeah. Now, how did the 503rd coordinate with the amphibious forces, including the 34th Infantry? How did the paratroopers coordinate with the tanks that landed?
Well, there were very few tanks. They had, but they had radios, and they had the wireless that they put in as soon as they got on there. What's interesting about the radio, though, is you'll find as you get to the middle of the book and Endo, the Japanese commander, starting to get this banzai charge together, they'd shut the radios off at night. And so it ends up hurting them that night when they get attacked because they can't coordinate because their radios are shut off. That's part of their SOP. So, but they did have radios around and they were keeping track of everything.
Any idea why the Japanese had over 6,000 on Corregidor with the ongoing Battle of Manila? It seems like they would have been needed in Manila.
I mean, I think they understood the significance of it. But again, these weren't total combat troops. These were a lot of guys, the Japanese defenders were crew from some of the ships that were sunk by American forces. So you'll find that some of the defenders didn't have rifles, or if they did, they were sharing one with another guy. A couple of them get into a fight with the rebar with a bayonet attached to the front of it. I mean, this really was a kind of a savage fight. And these defenders were really just, I don't want to say they were cannon fodder, but they weren't crack defensive troops. They were just guys that they had.
Here's a comment from Paul, who you went around Corregidor with. He said 20 Japanese POWs surrendered on January 1st, 1946, and they had been concentrated at Battery Monjo, which had never been retaken. Here's
Awesome.
another. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, he's the man.
He is the man.
This is from another person. I visited Corregidor myself back in 2015. Great trip, but I don't remember any flat ground on top side. Please describe the landing zone.
Okay, so it's two of them. You have the top in front of the mile high or mile long barracks. You have that open field where the flag is now, right? And that's the parade field. That's one of the landing zones. And then the other one was on the other side of that memorial area that's the golf course there.
Yeah, all overgrown. Overgrown.
It's all overgrown, and it's also very small. It's easy without Paul. Actually, another throwback to Paul. Paul took me around Corregidor. I would have missed it. He actually was the one that pointed it out because I couldn't see the golf course until he showed it to me.
We have a couple comments from Steve. He used to live on Corregidor, and he said
good.
about 20 died on the jump. A few got stuck in trees. Most of the Japanese were defending the beaches. And then he also says there's no tour right now due to COVID, and he really worries about the condition of the island at this point. I think you talked about some of this in your talk, but what was your primary source of information for research on the book?
Well, it was two things. A couple of things. One, I used Calhoun's memoir, which I had two versions of. I had one that he had printed out, and I got it from his daughter from his home in Texas. That had some of his handwritten notes in it, and then Paul Whitman, who runs basically the Corregidor site and is probably the greatest source of information on Corregidor. He had a edited version that he had edited and added context to, and I had that as well. And I was able to merge those two with Captain Bradford's book, The Surgeon, and then Nycom had an oral history, and then I did an interview with Tony Lopez. So I was able to weave all of those together with some of the archival documents from Paul's site, because he has all of it. He's got the orders, he's got all of it, and then that was it. And then there's a couple books have been written previously to this that were a little bit bigger, wider scope, but this book, I really tried to focus in on only those couple guys in order to give you sort of an intimate walk through the battle.
Well, it is a great day-by-day account. Probably one of the few I've ever seen. What was the press reaction to the retaking of Corregidor? The fall was a major news story. Was the retaking of Corregidor the same?
Sure. I mean, this was looked at as, redemption. I think it's important. It was I think it restored some of that, what was lost in 42. So it was, that was the reason why there was correspondence. That's the reason why, Nycom landing is part of the newsreels. I think it was very well covered, and it was a big deal taking it back.
Do you know how many press guys were put in with the 503rd? I mean, there was a couple that made the jump with them, wasn't there?
Yeah, one of them is with Lopez.
Wow.
Who, if you recall, he shoves him out the door, and then I'll let you read it in the book, but that's an interesting story in its own. Paul might know the exact number. To be honest, I don't have it in my notes right in front of me. I'd have to look it up.
Right. Well, we had one more comment saying it's the best preserved battlefield in the Pacific, and I'd probably have to agree with that. You know, it's doesn't look like it did, but definitely the structure's all still there. Everything's still there. Yeah, most definitely. And I think that now there's another question that's coming. What role, if any, did Fort Drum, the concrete battleship, play in the battle?
Not Paul, if you're here, correct me if I'm wrong, but not none that I'm aware of, or
Yeah.
not a major one that I'm aware of.
In 42, it had a major role, but
Yeah,
not during that point. There's another one. Do you know the date that MacArthur raised the flag on Corregidor? I think that you answered that. That's March 2nd, the day that he comes out there.
yeah.
Yeah. And then, well, there's a couple of questions that they've asked for me about our research. And it says, yes, you are correct. No role in the retaking of Corregidor. Paul is right on top of everything
Thank you, Paul.
being said tonight. Very good, Paul Whitman. And then we have people.
I can't stress enough, though, if this is something you're interested in, or you read the book and you're interested, Paul has got, not only does Paul's site, corregidor.org, have a bunch of really cool stuff, not only about the battle in 45, but the battle in 42, about the coastal guns. I mean, that site is a treasure trove. You'll get lost in it, trust me. But he also has done a lot of cool books, a lot of cool picture books that will only supplement what I'm able to do in this. I mean, Paul flew from Australia. I met him from here, from the United States, and we spent about a week out there, and it was great. And it's like walking around with Wikipedia. It's Corregidor Wikipedia.
Yes,
He's got all of it. And so, for all of you who are interested in this beyond the book, I just urge you to go to that site and look around. It's really fantastic stuff.
Can you speak more about the role of the 34th Infantry, in their landing?
I mean, they were important in that, you got that two-prong attack. When the paratroopers land on top, they take some of the pressure off, change the defense. It allows you to land some of the heavy equipment that you can't get in there by plane. They become really important too, because they're able to come up to topside and get some of the wounded and get them back out to the beach and evacuated off the island. So it's that great combined arms that they bring a lot of the more heavier equipment that the paratroopers just didn't have the ability to bring with them. And they alleviate some of the pressure. They're also, Malinta Hill is their main. They make a big push on that as well.
Here's another one. I've been there 4 or 5 times. The last time was early this year. They've had to brace up the walls of mile-long barracks and the cinema there. Even though it's very well preserved, it's still deteriorating. I would recommend one of the overnight tours and staying there. Yeah, he was just having some comment. I get comment about the place there where it is now. And Steve, again, fighting was brutal on Fort Drum, but separate. So it was a separate assault that they made there, and the Japanese were still resisting when MacArthur returned. But that seems to be about all the questions for tonight. So we appreciate it as much.
Thanks.
And now the people have been asking when it's going to be available, this whole talk that you did, and it'll be up on YouTube tomorrow. So anybody that missed it tonight or, didn't get to see it, it'll be up there for time immemorial. So everyone will be able to get to see it from now on. But we really do appreciate Kevin. We wish you the best with all the book. When you can get it on Amazon, you can get it pretty much at any bookstore, I imagine. And I think if you come to us, we can give you the prompt to where you can get it, because we sent it out before. But we really do appreciate your time, and thanks a lot. And let us know if you're ever working on something else.
I will. Thank you so much, Jim. Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
Thanks
Kevin.
for coming,
Take
everyone.
care. Appreciate it.